This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Frances Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the second half of St. John's Gospel. We're looking at the scene, which is scene 6, that John actually presents to us, and it concerns Jesus' origins. So this is verses 9 to 11. So Pilate went back to Jesus and said, "Where do you come from?" Now, poor Pilate is belonging to the unbelieving world, and so where do you come from doesn't necessarily mean do you come from heaven. He doesn't understand that at all. Luke 23 actually tells us that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, thinking that where you come from actually means your geographical origins, and Jesus geographically came from Galilee and so on. John is not going to deal with that aspect of the thing. John wants to go deeper into the reality of where Jesus actually comes from. Now, those of us who have travelled through the gospel up to now and have travelled through the final discourse, of course, we all know where Jesus came from, and we all also know where we come from because we have been born again in baptism as well. But for this question that it's not actually going to go anywhere, Jesus simply keeps silent. He doesn't respond. So then we have this thing where Pilate thinks that he has power over Jesus. If you remember back in the final discourse that Jesus said that the evil one had no power over him, neither has Pilate any power over Jesus. And so Jesus points out to him that only power resides in God. God alone has power. And when God moves in power, nobody can counteract it. And if God permits what is actually going on now, then that's why it is happening. And it just so happens that Pilate is the governor. There could have been somebody else. And so Pilate is not central to this thing at all. But when you look at the dangerous political struggle that's going on between Pilate and the Sanhedrin, Pilate actually has no power at this particular point because he knows he should set Jesus free. And he also knows that the Sanhedrin have got the better of him, and the Sanhedrin are going to push him. But Jesus actually proclaims the truth to Pilate. He wanted to know earlier if Pilate wanted the truth, but now he gives him a little bit of truth just to see can he open any kind of a chink in this man's soul. And so he tells him that this is God's doing, and if God has permitted this, as I said, it will happen. So it's not Rome and it's not Jerusalem that has the power in this Passover. It is the Father and the Son working together to bring about the redemption of the world. And this is why throughout the Gospel in chapters 2, 7, 8, 12, 13, this time has been called Jesus' hour. And you remember back in chapter 2 when our Blessed Mother wanted to intervene at Cana of Galilee, Jesus told her, "My hour has not yet come." And so we'll find that what happens between Jesus and herself now that the hour has come. So Jesus reminds Pilate that God is in control and he is the true emperor of the universe. Caesar is only a small cog in the wheel. So the true judge then actually judges his judge, if I can put it that way. The one who is theoretically the judge here is Pilate, but Jesus is the true judge. And Pilate doesn't know at this particular point that Jesus has the last word on his life, just as he has the last word on everybody's life. When he comes back in Revelation 19, he comes back as a judge to the human race. And in chapter 20, every single person who has ever lived has to stand before the great white throne. And the books will be opened and everything about us will be known. Jesus is the judge. And so Jesus is the one who actually pronounced judgment on Pilate and on Caiaphas and on Judas. So the one who handed me over to you has the greatest guilt. The one in the singular is Caiaphas, because he's the chief priest. And therefore, he's the one who made the decision back in chapter 11 to kill Jesus. He's in charge of the Sanhedrin. They're simply cooperating with him, and the people are cooperating with the Sanhedrin. So Jesus passes judgment on them. Let's go to scene number 7, which is the death sentence given to a man who has been declared 3 times to be innocent. So this is verses 12 to 16. From that moment, Pilate was anxious to set him free. But the Jews, meaning the Jewish leaders, said, "If you set him free, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself king is defying Caesar." Hearing these words, Pilate had Jesus brought out, seated himself on the chair of judgment at a place called the Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was Passover preparation day. It was the 6th hour. "Here is your king. Take him away, crucify him," they said. "Do you want me to crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So in the end, Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. There's just an enormous amount in these words. I haven't even read all the words for you, just the main words. So Pilate has just received a merciful judgment from Jesus, that the one who handed me over to you has greater guilt. And immediately we see that Pilate has no power over Jesus, none whatsoever. The Sanhedrin, though, has almost achieved its goal, and it's moving in mercilessly for the kill. It's going to they have to force Pilate's hand. They've admitted earlier that the true accusation was one of blasphemy. But the only way they can get Pilate to kill Jesus legally is to keep up the pretend king thing. And so Pilate and all Roman governors wore a ring on their finger, and stamped on that ring was "Friend of Caesar." And it was when they would sign a document, stamping the document with that ring saying "Friend of Caesar" after their name, that everybody knew it had the authority of the Roman government. So if the Jewish Sanhedrin want to really unseat Pilate, they tell him, "You are no friend of Caesar." The sad bit is, we know from the final discourse of Jesus that the true disciples, the beloved disciples, are all friends of God and prophets. Wouldn't you prefer to be a friend of God than a friend of Caesar? And so they pressure Pilate to kill Jesus as a pretender king. It's really sad. And this is just politics. Even the chief priests don't seem to know what they're doing. It was a fact that the Sanhedrin literally hated the emperor and anything to do with him. But just at this moment, this is a useful tool to use. And this is how cynical the whole thing is. But they all knew that Pilate wouldn't risk the ire of Caesar, because Pilate couldn't survive an investigation into his conduct in office, because that would mean that all his misdemeanors would actually be brought to the surface and he would be thrown out. Tiberius was the reigning Caesar at the time, and he lived like a recluse on the island of Capri. And he was absolutely paranoid by concerning the men who represented him in the various parts of the empire, and he demanded absolute personal loyalty to himself. So if he got a report that was negative about Pilate, he would be completely ruthless. Pilate would simply get a message, either commit suicide or go into exile, which he did eventually get that message. So Pilate realizes that either he's going to die or Jesus is going to die. It's not going to be him. And here we come to this twist that only John can bring out for us. And that is that Jesus dies for Pilate. Jesus dies for the Sanhedrin. Jesus dies for his enemies. Jesus dies for everyone. And Jesus dies for Barabbas as well. Jesus dies for Judas, even if Judas doesn't want him. And the amazing thing is, Judas, the Sanhedrin, Pilate, none of them cared. And Barabbas, none of them cared about Jesus at all. And yet he would die for them. And so we have this extraordinary mystery of love meeting hate. So in verse 13, we have Pilate capitulating. And he is going to now hand over an innocent man to be crucified, given the worst possible death that could be meted out to anybody. But if he is going to give in, he is going to make the Sanhedrin pay the highest price for this life. Now, at the very beginning of this terrible drama, the Sanhedrin merely paid the price of a slave to Judas for Jesus. But now they're going to have to pay with their temple, their city, and their nation. They're going to have to pay with permanent exile. They're going to have to pay because the cosmos is a terrible thing to actually disturb because it's under the power of the evil one. And so Pilate is going to make them renounce their nationalistic expectation of a Davidic Jewish Messiah. And they're going to have to actually choose Caesar, the representative of the kingdom of this world, the representative of the cosmos and the unbelieving world. And my reaction to that is, wow, doesn't Satan know how to make you pay? Wow. You have to give up the very things that they were fighting all the time to try and preserve. They will all go. And we come to a point where we have a bit of a dispute as to the translation. And that is that the text says that Pilate had Jesus brought out. And most of the translations will say that Pilate sat himself on the chair of judgment. But actually, a better translation says that Pilate seated Jesus on the chair of judgment. This is what totally makes sense of the text. The crowned and robed and acclaimed King of the Jews is now going to sit in the chair of judgment, listening to his own people absolutely cut him off and cut off everything to do with God. It's really, really scary. But of course, if Pilate is in the chair of judgment, it doesn't make the same sense at all. So we've already seen Jesus as the real judge, and now he is going to witness his people choose the cosmos. So this is the awesome moment when the chosen people of God, the people of the covenant, the people who have been blessed by God's presence all these years, they publicly, before the powers of the world, they reject their God, they reject their Messiah, they reject their King. We have no king but Caesar. This is a frightful decision. There's going to be terrible, terrifying consequences. Millions of lives will be lost as a result of this. You have to remember that at the Passover, they commemorated God's judgment on the cosmos in the Exodus, because the cosmos was represented by the superpower of Egypt at the time. Okay? And so it was God's judgment on the cosmos in favor of his chosen people. Now you have the chosen people choosing the cosmos and absolutely repudiating their call. It's frightening. It's really frightening. So on this Passover, it's the judgment of Israel, with their messianic Davidic king on the seat of judgment in the capital city of Jerusalem. In order to get Jesus, they renounced God as their king. Now, you know, if you've read the Old Testament, that God was their true king. And when they chose kings to rule over them, that king, they understood, was a servant of God. And the main duty of the king was actually to make sure that the covenant of God was kept alive. Other kings, other nations had earthly kings, but their king was God. And so you'll see this very clearly if you go into Judges chapter 8, the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, second book of Samuel, chapter 7, Isaiah 26, Psalm 2, verse 7, and so on and so on. It's all over the place. So the only person who could rule over God's people who was somebody raised up by God himself, as is very, very clear in the choice of King David, for example. And now here we are at this very solemn moment of Passover, the greatest feast of Israel. All the people of Israel are involved and they're celebrating their deliverance from the cosmos and their covenant with God. And the Sanhedrin, their supreme religious body, break the covenant publicly, and they thus put themselves back into the slavery of the cosmos as they declare Caesar, the very symbol of the realm of below, to be their chosen king. I mean, it is just terrifying. Truly, their hatred of Jesus has taken them way, way beyond anything that even they could have imagined. And their renunciation of the Messiah is done with the crowned, robed Messiah king seated in judgment in front of them, silent, peaceful, forgiving, loving, as always. You couldn't have a drama bigger than this. So, for the Sanhedrin, for the chosen people of God, this is the ultimate blasphemy. And they have brought Jesus here on a charge of blasphemy. And here they themselves commit a blasphemy very much greater than anything they're accusing Jesus of. And yet, the amazing thing is that if you shift from this lower level where all of this drastic stuff is going on and shift on to the higher level, the level of above, God is going to transcend all of this. And God is going to use all of this terrible stuff. He will transcend it. And Jesus, all alone, unaided by the chosen people, unaided by the Sanhedrin, will take on the evil spirit that's destroying everybody. The evil spirit that rules the cosmos. And he will battle that spirit and prevail. And he will do it in a very, very short time. But he will do it all alone. And so the silence of the Lamb is absolutely incredible. But of course, if you read Isaiah 53, you'll be told there in Isaiah 53 that Jesus was like a silent lamb before his shearers. That's exactly as you see him. So in spite of everything that's actually going on, in spite of the fact that it looks as if everything is being destroyed by human beings, Jesus will still create a new covenant in his own blood. He will still create a new era of grace and mercy for the whole human race. He will inaugurate the messianic kingdom of God. He will usher in the new covenant. And he will make his precious blood available to heal the sin and rebellion of the world. But what we've got to look at is that all this sin and all this rebellion against God in the cosmos cannot prevent God from carrying out his will on earth as he has decided in heaven. In spite of them all, everything that Jesus has promised us in the final discourse is going to actually happen. And so you can see that we actually needed all the teaching in the final discourse of Jesus to make sense out of this. If we were dealing with this without all of that knowledge, we would probably read it on the level of below as absolute disaster and not understand that every single point is actually a victory for Jesus. We just need to know that this final breaking of the covenant of Moses is at 12 noon on Passover Eve. This is terribly important because the Lamb of God is going to die at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it will be St. Matthew's Gospel who will actually bring out the fact that at the moment when the Lamb actually dies, that the veil of the temple is torn in two, not by a human hand. In other words, signifying the end of the covenant of Moses, the end of the Old Testament time, and the end of all that the Sanhedrin actually stood for. In fact, the Sanhedrin will sort of go on for a few years, a bit like ivy growing on a wall, not knowing that the roots have been destroyed. But it's all over for them, and it's all beginning for the rest of us. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World Podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.